If you watched any movie, and I mean any movie, from the last 40 years, they bear some mark of the impact of the new Hollywood style. The pacing, the dialogue, the camera placement, these can all be somewhat loosely attributed back to one particular time from the mid-60s to the early 80s, where an elite group of auteurs took the subject matters of the time, mixed in some French New Wave, and presented films that are still talked about to this day. Today, I want to take a look at the impact of New Hollywood, the influences the period has on modern film, and its legacy in broader film history. For starters, it's an odd period to talk about. First off, it's hard to actually nail what is New Hollywood. Sure, you can point to examples like Bonnie and Clyde, Easy Rider, and The Graduate as all being films that are a little edgy, contemporary themes about young people's place in society and their roles in it, as well as cinematography that all feels similar. However, it's once you leave that area and enter into more murky territory that the thesis falls apart, like the seemingly old school style of The Godfather or the Titanic blockbusters of Jaws and Star Wars. Despite these three films being made by New Hollywood people, it seems to clash a little. This leads into the question of when does the era begin and when does it stop? While the successes of Jaws and Star Wars point to the emergence of blockbusters and super blockbusters' less reliance on mid-budget, character-focused dramas, sound familiar to anyone? You still have acid-dipped, character-driven films like Taxi Driver and Blowout emerge around the same period. This is to say that perhaps the period starts and ends at the peaks of its popularity, with the emergence of Bonnie and Clyde as a bona fide hit and Midnight Cowboy winning Best Picture serving as the start of the period, and the release of Star Wars acting as the end. This end is important, as in the same year of Star Wars, we have the release of Close Encounters of the Third Kind, both monster hits released by New Hollywood directors, and releases like Sorcerer and New York, New York, both of which were released by New Hollywood directors but had a more art house feel, quote unquote, and failed at the box office. That was the theme of the end of this period. As the 70s went on and stories of hotshot directors either overexerting their power and will on set or incessantly clashing with the studios, film studios looked to correct these issues and really button up with the amount of power they gave to directors. But we'll get to that later. The key takeaways for how to see New Hollywood and its greater style are essentially a few things. Incorporating classical plot elements from the 30s and 40s with European and Japanese filmmaking techniques, a subjective approach to not only narrative structure but to the climax in particular, a heavy focus on characters, particularly a centralized character, and using political or generally socially unacceptable themes as your themes. All of these, or some of these themes, can be applied across the board with New Hollywood and particularly into our current state of film. The successors to New Hollywood come in the form of the independent filmmaking boom of the 90s, as emerging filmmakers like Richard Linklater, Quentin Tarantino, and Paul Thomas Anderson release their iconic films and start to get their foothold in the industry. Not only were these films, and others of the time, auteur-driven and lacked major studio involvement, but they also carried over some stylistic input. It's no secret that Tarantino is a big nut for Brian De Palma, particularly Blowout.
Brian De Palma's Blowout. I think it's one of the greatest movies ever made. It's Brian De Palma's finest film. All right, which means it's one of the finest movies ever made, because as we all know, Brian De Palma is the greatest director of his generation.
Not solely relying on De Palma's themes of violence and a little bit of sexual content, Tarantino utilized very specific style choices, like intense zooms and frantic movement, which are commonly associated with New Hollywood directors. You can also see the Scorsese influence when it comes to editing. While it can be argued that something like Goodfellas is too late in the game to be considered New Hollywood, the quick editing of that and other films is carried over from French New Wave films, much like how De Palma was influenced by Jean-Luc Godard and others. Tarantino takes these influences and melds them together along with the pulpy and extreme elements of the exploitation films he riffs on. PTA is of the same vein, with his heroes being Martin Scorsese and Robert Altman. You can see the character study stuff in There Will Be Blood and a little bit of Phantom Thread, but the Altman influence of big ensemble casting with Boogie Nights and Magnolia is definitely felt. While that's not a particular highlight of the New Hollywood style, PTA's usage of the central character evoking the themes and plots of his work definitely feel very New Hollywood-y. Licorice Pizza is another big example of the influence the era had on PTA, so much so that it can maybe dip into parody. He goes so much out of his way to make you feel like you're in the era and that the filmmaking is of that era, especially when the film is literally about two young people trying to find their way in the world. Moving on to Linklater, and the influences take a bit of a turn, less into the fast-paced and character study style and more of a French New Wave influence with less focus on plot and more on general style. This, of course, is connected to New Hollywood with all the influence they took from the French. Linklater particularly cites Francois Truffaut and, going away from the French and more Japanese, Yasujiro Ozu as some of his influences. This can be seen with films like Dazed and Confused and Slacker, where the focus is less on plot and more about understanding the characters and their behavior. This kind of hangout-like atmosphere can be connected to French films like L'Eclisse and American films like The Graduate. Slower with loose plots and scenarios, rather than scenes that specifically build up to form a true story, these were elements that can be pulled straight from something like Tokyo Story. But Linklater is able to co-opt these elements together with his eye for filmmaking to make something entirely unique, a la the directors of the New Hollywood era. There are plenty of other directors who follow from the styles and influences of the era, but I more so want to focus on the general stylistic changes that have occurred since the 70s and how it all connects together. Firstly, some of the tackier stylistic choices have been cut out. The seemingly unmotivated wide shots, the snap zooms, and more of the exaggerated elements from the years past have largely been replaced in favor of more realistic or more so naturalistic choices. While there are exceptions and homages to the old style, modern American filmmaking leans into presenting the story in a naturalistic manner, lending itself more towards the Italian neorealism of the post-World War II era more than anything. The idea of shooting on location and presenting these characters as they are can be found in documentary-style filmmakers like Sean Baker, Greta Gerwig, and Barry Jenkins. Within that naturalistic style, however, the films have become incredibly character-driven. The blockbusters will always be the blockbusters. However, the mid-budget and art house films have been taking an implicit or explicit subject matter and utilizing a central character to relay that point to the audience. Taxi Driver, anyone? It's tough to actually quantify the larger stylistic impact of this period with today, as things have changed so drastically. In the 80s, it was the shift from independent auteurs to giant corporations getting their hold on the studio system. It was about the marketing, how profitable your film was, how they could get this product out there in the most digestible manner possible. While this concept still applies today, especially with regards to how quote-unquote content is looked at, the landscape has grown and shifted so drastically that everyone is scrambling. The explosion of international markets like China and India, the influx of foreign films and shows and pop culture, the insane grip social media algorithms have on our viewing habits and our lives, all these things and more have happened in such a short time that has caught everyone off balance. Sure, the corporations still look for the bottom dollar, but now they have become even more selective with film investments. Why spend $20 million on a film that may not get that box office return when they can grab some more money together, throw it into a blockbuster, and grab a ton of money from there? Even if the blockbuster fails or doesn't reach expectations, it's usually centered around a popular IP, or intellectual property for those who don't know, that will be a part of a greater universe that will always be popular. Plus, they can use that blockbuster as a type of marketing to their investors and sponsors to show that they make big movies, which will incentivize those investors and sponsors to give them more money. They see the perceived failures of films like Nightmare Alley or Annihilation and don't put money towards those kinds of projects, given their budget needs and lack of IP. It also doesn't help that without the mass sale of Blu-rays and DVDs, you don't get that second cycle of money that they were used to in years past. The 80s had its problems, but it feels so quaint and small compared to the problems the film industry is facing today. In addition to these rapid structural changes, we have seen an explosion of new technology introduced into the industry, especially in the cases of larger movies. In the 70s and early 80s, film nerds were scrambling to find new and innovative technological edges to help show their vision. Francis Ford Coppola, Steven Spielberg, and George Lucas were always looking for ways that the technology of the time could help advance their stories. Now, it almost feels like the current tech has burdened filmmakers. It may also be a combination of the bland, mass-produced nature of some of the blockbusters nowadays and their formulaic structure, but the massive budgets and advancements in CGI create these formulas that the incoming directors have to adhere to. It feels very much like the studios are almost saying, okay, we need a small fight here, then a big fight here. We also need something to put in the trailer here. Also, remember to throw something in here for social media. Also, the colors need to be this and that and so on. It's such an incredibly uncreative formula for creative people. Lastly, the impact can be found in subtler ways and ways that are less grand. The negatives of directors having all the power brought on new rules and standards for how to behave on set. New Hollywood brought on younger and more liberal voices at the time, which then trickled into a lot of the positions of power in the industry as everyone got older and the New Hollywood people were able to get a further foothold in the industry. Genres like the gangster film, the parody film, and the coming-of-age film were all either introduced or recontextualized for the time. How about just all the names that became absolute household names? Nicholson, De Niro, Pacino, Redford, Eastwood, Streep, etc., etc. New angles were taken for genres like comedy, horror, action, sci-fi, you name it. Ultimately, it's a bit of a cliche to state something like the New Hollywood era will be remembered for times to come as an innovative era of fantastic films made by pioneer directors or some crap like that, but it's true. Across generations, across races and cultures, these filmmakers and films shape the minds and sensibilities of so many people. Its legacy is felt throughout American and international cinema, as directors young and old owe a lot of their style to the advancements made during this golden era. Hell, a bunch of them are still working and putting out great stuff. Well, some of them. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoy this content, please like and subscribe. Also, comment below what topic we should cover next. Thanks again, and have a great day.